we're talking about this idea of how to neighbor. And not just a simple, like we talk about a lot of this stuff when it comes around the holidays, not just how to be a good neighbor, but literally when Jesus comes and he starts to teach us how to love, he says, I want to establish a new kingdom. And the new kingdom is going to be based upon a currency, and the new currency is going to be love. In fact, he says a new command that he gives to us, that we're supposed to love one another, but not just love in the way the world had known up until that point. You see, up until that point, they understood the idea of reciprocal love. I love you if you love me. If you can scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. But Jesus comes and says, no, I'm talking about an entirely different version of love. A love that reaches out to you whether you live across the back fence, across the street, across the tracks, or across the world. A love that says, I'm going to choose to love you, and I'm going to choose to have you as my neighbor, even if we don't look the same, even if we don't talk the same, even if we don't vote the same, and even if we don't believe the same. You see, when Jesus gives this new command to love, he says it's despite all of those things aren't an excuse not to love. And so he comes with this new form of love, and he says, here's how we're supposed to approach the world. People who don't look like us, talk like us, believe like us, vote like us, all those things don't matter. We're supposed to approach them with the very same love. And so we've been using as a springboard to talk about some very difficult topics, some challenging topics. Last week we talked about embracing orphans, and we have some other topics that are coming that are really deep and powerful topics we're going to address. But we're using as a springboard a discussion that Jesus has with a guy who was considered an expert in the Old Testament law. He was a lawyer in the sense that he was an expert in the Old Testament law. And he knew what the law required. He knew what the law expectation was there. And he comes to Jesus in the account that we're about to read in Luke chapter 10. He comes to Jesus and he's trying to trip Jesus up with the questions. He's not there to gain information. As much as he is, he's trying to, like many of the religious leaders of Jesus' day, he says, I'm going to catch him. I'm going to cause him to make a mistake. So he comes to Jesus and he says to Jesus, Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Now, Jesus knew that the guy was trying to trick him, and he also knew that he was an expert in the law. And he says, well, you know the law. What does the law require of you? The guy summarizes the law, says, well, I'm supposed to love God with all my heart, soul, and mind, and I'm supposed to love my neighbor as myself. And Jesus says, well, there you go. You got it. You don't need me, like you have it figured out. And the verse we kind of left off with last week, we're going to pick up with this week. Jesus is speaking to him, and he says, I know what you're trying to say there. Somehow I lost my page. Sorry about that. But go ahead and put the verse up there. In Luke chapter 10, he says, he desiring to justify himself. He says he trying to back up the behavior that he'd had. He tries to justify himself, and he says to Jesus, and who is my neighbor? He says, but Jesus, I get the expectation that was there, but Jesus, define for me for a second, who is my neighbor? And Jesus uses this to launch into a discussion about the parable of the Good Samaritan. As Jesus goes into the discussion about the parable of the Good Samaritan, he uses as the hero of that story, he uses a person who everyone else in Jesus' culture would have looked down on. He uses the Samaritan, a person who was very different from Jesus, a person who was very different from the culture that Jesus lived in. He used a person who was separated. We'll talk about this next week. Ethnically and racially and culturally, he was very different. But he also was separated geographically. And he says, I'm going to use that guy to be the hero of the story because he chooses to look down with compassion on the person who needs help radically.